In the grim darkness of the far future, amidst the ravaged battlefields and forgotten corners of the universe, whispers of unspeakable horrors echo through the void. Welcome, brave souls, to a realm where fear reigns supreme, and the line between sanity and madness is but a fragile thread. Welcome to the twisted tales of Warhammer Horror. The Somewhere Sister, by Jeremy Lambert. I'd been here before, and so had she. I was outside, once again, looking at the Somewhere Sister. The old inn was nestled in what trees remained at the foot of the mountain, a towering thing with too many stairs and too many rooms. The snow-covered road beneath my feet bent towards the inn briefly and continued past it into the wasteland expanse of Cellar. The Somewhere Sister was the last stop before the impossible road to Oraniskath, home of the annual festival of master smiths and their wonderful works. But it was a death wish for anyone foolish enough to attempt the journey. We catered to those fools, and there were many of them once, though few now remain. The rooms at my inn remain empty most nights. But that is not what concerned me. What concerned me, what made my blood run cold, was my twin sister. She had been missing these many moons, yet there she stood, motionless in the middle of the road before me, barefoot in the snow, her mouth stretched open in a scream I would never hear. Her eyes glared like moonlight, shining back at me. I wished she would move. A turn of the head, a stumbled foot forward. Something, anything, would be better, would be less of a horror than nothing. But she did not indulge. She never did. Until now, I felt myself take a step towards her. It all felt distant, like something someone else had done. I took another, and another. I could walk, which meant tonight was different, which meant tonight was no nightmare. I was close now. I tried to find her eyes inside the lights, her real ones, not the bright, pleading things wandering the night like search lanterns. For all of her stillness, she was panicked. I wanted to tell her that I was here, that I would care for her, that I wouldn't leave like she did. The voice echoed in my head, though her lips did not move, yet something was moving in her mouth. I could see it now, even with her eyes near blinding my own. I would have been forgiven for thinking it was her tongue, as the thing inside searched for something it couldn't find. But no, it was a finger, and it wasn't alone. There were others, long, thin things. They belonged to a hand, reaching out for me. Another hand now, its pale and spindly fingers worming past the edges of my sister's lips, gripping them. Her scream was pulled wider, her jaw impossibly open, impossibly broken, until I could see the thing's face. The violet creature was climbing out of her mouth, blood streaming through its fingers, its claw-like nails drawing even more as the skin stretched and tore. Its terrible eyes glowered in the dark, finding me. Vendriel. I heard the voice again. Last sister of somewhere. It knew my name. The lights in her eyes went out and the road went dark. Not just the road. Everything. No lights from the inn. No moonlight by which to see anything at all. Nothing. A cold, dark void. But I am here. Here with you. What felt like the brush of frigid lips against my ear sent a shiver through me. I pulled back, turning away as if it would change my circumstances. A spell that would propel me elsewhere. But here, with me, it was still dark. The next thing I remember, I was back inside the Somewhere Sister. The third room, on the third floor, sitting in front of the only companion I truly had left, my mother's ether quartz mirror. My reflection in it was like a fading memory, the exhausted elf staring back at me, nearly as pale as the moon itself. Even my hair was near white in the moonlight. I half expected my reflection to wither away, crumble into ash and fall to the floor to be forgotten, to disappear, every time I found myself wandering, which was indeed Mother's word for it. Mother's just had one of her wanderings, little one. Not to worry even though I left you alone. All alone with the many guests of many rooms, each of them hungry, oh so starving now, and who is going to feed them? Can it be you? I would find myself back in her room, sitting before her mirror, like one of the Sire time-warping curses had wound out of the wastes and landed here. Like time itself had leapt forward to place me back before the mirror, staring at myself looking so like my sister Velethir, but never quite as put together, never quite as flawless as my twin. My memory of the gap in time was as much a dark void as the night itself. The old room was still empty. No longer my mother's, no longer my sister's, and something less than mine, though it had served as my bed since Velethir disappeared. I was left wondering what it was. The thing in the dark? Not Velethir, that much I knew. My mind is quiet, and it never used to be when she was here. Always connected, Iliathan twins. Even now I reach out to her, but where I would normally find her thoughts, her very feelings along with my own, in tune with my own, there is a harrowing silence. In my head it means she is no longer there. In my heart, she remains. Somewhere. Taken, hidden, trapped, and not just some discarded bit of blood, flesh and bone with its castaway eyes alight no longer. Because she would never leave me. I would have thought all of it a nightmare but for my frozen bare feet, still wet from the snow outside the inn. The trail of puddled footprints on the floor leading back to the door would suggest the same. My apron too, what as it was. It wasn't the first time this had happened, with me left wondering how I got here, how I had come back in from the cold, or another room at the inn, the cellar. I stood from the chair in my room, the one next to the mirror, my legs creaking like rusty hinges, and went to the window. It felt like mere moments ago, even though daylight had already come and gone once more. There was nothing but the road winding away from the inn and a single set of footprints, made in the otherwise untouched blanket of snowfall, leading back here. The footprints were alone. I sat back in the chair before the mirror. My feet were frozen, warmth coming back to them too slowly. The mirror drew my gaze as it always did, and upon seeing my face, I half expected something to crawl out from within me this time. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to remove the thing from my mind, the thing that tore Velethir apart. There was no room for anything else, while that memory, that fear, remained. I remembered Mother's words of the mind being blinding in its focus, an insurmountable wall to what you desire, your very own worst enemy, and just another inevitable reason to pull the distractions, the horrid emotional toil, from me and into the other courts, to focus on the real matters at hand, the real engines of life. And that is what I was to do now. My mother's mirror held our family's ether quartz, what little of it we had, wrought within fine gold filigree encircling its glass. An elegant swaddling for her more precious children, the ones receiving more attention than her daughters of flesh and blood. The things were held in place around the edges of the family heirloom by the crescent and sphere designs of Hessian moons. Before her death, she took to spending nights in her room, not even coming down for her own meals, as Velethir and I ran the wine and food to the tables, mopped the mud from the floors, cleaned the linen and laundry, all in her absence. She insisted on her time with the mirror, my mother, gazed into it for hours, sometimes all day, sometimes all night, siphoning the ether quartz enlightening potential and storing her every dark feeling into the now vacant and hungry thing in return. A trade of the only currency we had, an exchange almost too good to be true. When she was done, she wasn't happy, but gone was the gloom of before. It was those moments where she could not even feel the tears that glistened on her cheek that frightened me even more. Yet she yearned for Velethir and me to spend our own time with the mirror, to grow enlightened, focused, ascendant, rid ourselves of what might harm us. I had my fear and worry. Velethir had her anger, her rashness. The mirror was no picky thing. It took all of it, everything. When the shards of ether quartz had nothing left to give and stored all that we could muster, Mother would fit the mirror with new ones, our precious ether quartz supply dwindling down until this very moment, when there are none left but the ones in the mirror. Where the spent others went, the ones filled with everything we wished to forget, was the cellar. Mother disposed of them, the dark cellar with the floor cold as ice and the oft-dormant furnace in the corner to keep the wine from freezing, little more than a grated hearth. It was Velethir who took the job of descending the cellar steps for anything our guests might need, or something to replenish in the kitchen. And two, when Mother was gone, discarding the spent shards. She had locked me down there once. When we were children, I would never forget the resulting hours spent alone in the cellar, my mind turning the grate of the furnace into a wicked metal-wrought grin mere moments from creaking its way across the stone floor and gobbling me up. This fear went to the mirror, so I could learn to cope, learn to master my fear. The other quartz offered such a renewed focus with each of the new, untapped shards in the mirror. So much to pull from it, so much to store within it. Balance, equilibrium. Our way was a potent pendulum of peaks and valleys with a yearning for stable, even ground. A way to forget our diminishing guests, relevance, existence. Our supply was so precious, so valuable, but so too was our balance, was it not? Our well-being, our enlightened dreams of anything, everything, better. So, like the guests at our inn, our supply began to dwindle, and Mother did her best to save the shards for us. Until the day Mother died. I say die because it's been too long. I desperately hope to never say such a thing about Velethir, but that hope is dwindling too. I was the last to see Mother, staring out the open door. Her hand rested on the door like she'd been there a while, thinking, the same thin hand that somehow had the strength to pull me up from the ground when I had fallen as a child, more times than any could count. She said she was going out to see the Cellar bloom. We had a guest at the time, a Centillion Sellsword with no discernible manners who slopped up meals like they were his last, but he had paid for room and board, and paid well. 3 shards well. He overheard Mother from the corner of the room and asked after the bloom, how anything like that could even grow here, before the wastes. A Cellar flower is as beautiful in the countryside as it is in the cobblestones of Zintel, she said, offering me a sad smile. I thought little of it, staying to refill the Sellsword's cup until he was snoring on the floor. We never saw her again. Velethir and I spirited more away from us, and into the mirror shards than I would care to admit. And yet Velethir fared better than I. She even took our mother's old room. How she could stand it, I didn't know. Not until after Velethir, too, was gone. My grief made manifest over someone I cannot find, cannot bury. There. The voice again. Not in my head but in the room. Faint. I looked around the small room with the bed of worn woven Zintel fabrics. The vanity and mirror before me. Only me. Me and the mirror. Sister. The voice terrified me as much as it did before. But I couldn't feel anything from the mirror, from the shards woven around it. They had no room left for me. I stared, tried to push all the pain away, all the terror I had relived. But the once hungry mirror was sated. It felt like whatever held my heart in place gave way, plummeting, a pit with no bottom. The very last of our ether quartz, my only aid in this place, was spent. Vendriel. There. I found where it came from, the same voice from outside, and what I could only hope was merely yesterday, whispered to me from the mirror, coming from within it, even, or within the walls themselves, like some forgotten, whispering thing, winding its way through plank and floorboard, its chill rush of air finding. Sister. When I heard the knock below, someone was at the door. I could not remember the last knock upon it. There have been no guests since Velethir disappeared. Night had already fallen once more. My feet ached in descent as I rushed to the window to look at the road below. I had no desire to hurry down the stairs to open the door. Fear's claws already dug deep before the knock. I wanted to be with the mirror, send it all away so I could rest. I beg, just rest. A reprieve, however brief. I didn't want to feel this way anymore. I couldn't stand it, could never stand it. But the shards were spent. There was nothing I could do, nowhere I could go. And now a lone figure stood just a few steps back from the entrance to the inn, looking up at me. Short, stout, and everything Velethir was not, dashing whatever hope I had left. I pulled open the window to speak to the figure, and snow loosed from the sill, falling below, landing on the stranger. He immediately shook his head, vigorously wiping snow from a face I couldn't see. By Grumney, a low, rumbling voice barked, caught in the cold wind and carried up to me. There was a pushcart next to him, a sturdy wooden thing with something inside it nestled in furs and blankets. A traveler, a fool, a paying guest, I thought, a Duarden, at that. And if he didn't have ether quartz, whatever he did have could be traded for it. What I took to be snow on the cloaked stranger was a massive white beard, He brushed the actual snow from it with thick, leather-gloved hands. Treat all your guests this way, or just the ones in the middle of the night? I simply stared, unable to bring voice to my lips. The Duarden shifted his feet and lifted his eyebrows to look at me. Big bushy things. I could see them all the way up here in the dim light from the third-story window. Not that I expected much from your lot, mind, he said, but at least an open door could be in order. By the time I started a fire in the hearth, he'd already taken off the heavy boots and hides that covered him, leaving the snow-dampened things just inside the door. His only protection appeared to be a hammer holstered in his belt, as small and stout as himself, more tool than weapon. The old cart was parked outside, but he had already carried in the thing it bore. I didn't know what was wrapped in all of that, but this wouldn't be the first Duarden on their way to the Syri festival in an attempt to prove their race equal, or beyond, in smithing. He wouldn't be the last to perish on the journey, either. Whatever it was, he set it down next to a table, gently, tapping the top of it like he was proudly tousling the hair of a child. I could tell he was small, even for a Duarden, his beard more gray than white, younger than I thought. He held his beard to his chest as he sat down at the nearest table, the wooden chair groaning beneath the weight of him. He tossed a small pouch on the table and pulled it open. A handful of amber stones rattled onto the wood. It wasn't the first time we'd been paid with them, and I recognized the bones of amber just from the sound of them rattling together in his pouch. It was enough to get him a room every night for a month. My heart leapt for the first time with hope. He kicked out his feet like he had just finished a day in the salt mines and chuckled. Nothing like your bare feet on solid stone. Hope you don't mind. And I sold some right sturdy gloves for them bones, he said, nodding his head at the things on the table. So I'm hoping they'll do. He grinned, revealing a missing front tooth, and wiggled the toes of his naked feet on the stone floor beneath. I shook my head, even though I very much did mind. But that wasn't the reason for my nerves, was it? My body was almost shaking at the thought of the other stranger out there, just beyond the door. Were the bones enough for more ether quartz? It looked like it. A few shards, only. Though a few shards might be all I needed until Velithir returned. But I am here. They certainly will, I said, snatching each of them from the table with barely concealed haste. I'll fetch food and water. From the cellar, if you'd like. I'd offered it out of habit. The cellar was the last place I wished to be. I hoped he would say no. I'd been down to the cellar only once since Velithir's disappearance. It was the same as before, my fear overwhelming me. Intrusive fears I couldn't stomach, and the fiery grate that could gobble you up. The gruff Duarden simply slapped the bulging pack resting on the table, the thing likely his weight or more. Got me enough hardtack to last a journey to Gur and back on one of them Caradron sky ponies. But I'll give ya whatever I have, even trade ya some if you have a use for it, to munch down on just about anything else. He pulled some of the hardtack from the pack, a thick, wafer-like thing that he thumped on the table as if it were a door knocker. Not a crumb fell from it. Jordy don't let me leave home unless I got a year's worth or more of this damnable grit. Comes in handy, sure, but just as like to crack a tooth as quell the grumbles. Not that I have the heart to tell him mind. He makes it special for me. He brushed his long gray hair back from his face, wisps of it everywhere like his wind-tousled beard. He grinned. I couldn't help but stare at the place where one of his front teeth was supposed to be. Ah, and this, he said, pointing to the gap in his teeth, is a different story altogether. One best told over ale, if yet be so kind. I could see his face fall when I frowned. Apologies, friend, but with being so out of the way, we only hold on to things with a longer shelf life. Those bushy eyebrows shot back up, intrigued, hopeful. Spirit. Wine, I said, knowing it was no consolation, caught between the fear of the cellar and need of his realm stone. He buried his face in rough, chapped hands, muttering to himself, "Grumney save us all. I could pour it into a tankard if that makes you feel better," I said. His fist slammed on the table, and I half expected the next blow to be aimed at me. But when I looked up from the table where his fist had nearly splintered the thing, there was a grin on his face, his laugh like the boom of a cannon. "Oh ho ho, don't you know it? I'll take you up on that. So long as ye don't water it down none. The door to the cellar was in the kitchen, near the back of the inn. Oats, grains, produce from all over Sire. Even spices mother couldn't live without from Iliotha, untouched and unused. Now rotten things from a home I never knew. And here the cellar door stood in front of me, waiting. It led down to the wide room of cold stone, stale air, and the thing that smiled at me, the furnace. I felt the air on my ankles, whispering out from the crack beneath the door, coming and going as if the cellar was some breathing thing. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. I didn't want to do this. I just wanted to go back to the Duarden and say I was sorry, so sorry. Sister. It was louder now, like it was next to me. From the cellar, I heard the Duarden drag the chair along the floor, closer to the fire, most likely. His only care in the world throwing another log on the flames, and I so desperately wished to trade places with him. Anything then be. Right here. I am right here. It sounded like Velithir, this time. Really sounded like her. I opened the door. I stared down into the dark cellar, but there was no voice, just a rush of stale air and silence from below. Gods, the smell was horrid. Rats feasting on spoiled things meant for guests who never came. Meant for a family bigger than one. I stepped back into the kitchen, took one of the candles from the cupboard and lit it, turning back to the cellar. Had I not heard the voice, the one that made its way through the crack beneath the door, I wouldn't have been able to take that first step down, or the next few. Leaning down as the old oak beneath my feet groaned its displeasure and disuse, holding the candle out as far as I could, illuminating the long wooden racks which lined the walls. All the things I've wanted all this time. All the things I survived without just to not be. Here. The voice nearly made me fall. Yet I managed to take another step down to the lone, flickering flame in the cold dark cellar. Everything as we left it. All along. The voice was coming from the corner. But the only thing I could see was the furnace, there, in the back, hidden in the dark. I held the candle higher, its flickering amber light growing around me. But the corner was still in shadow and I didn't dare step closer. There were things behind the furnace. I couldn't tell what. Things I don't remember. Don't want to. The voice knew my thoughts like Velithir does. Like Velithir did. Hello? I whispered to the darkness. My voice echoed and died in the room. No answer to it. I turned to the wooden rack next to me. 2 bottles of wine lay next to each other, pinned to the side of the rack by an old, rotting barrel that had long lost whatever was inside it. Ale the Duarden would no doubt have enjoyed, once upon a time. Suddenly there was more light in the cellar, more than just from my candle. I could see it reflecting off the bottles. The furnace? I didn't want to look. I reached for one of the bottles, had my hand on the neck of it when I heard the chittering, a small sound, like a cold, shivering thing's teeth from the corner. It was coming from beneath the furnace. Glistening things surrounded it, like so many crystals reflecting candlelight, but in the middle of them all 2 eyes. Her eyes, wandering in the dark, shining up through the shadows, finding me. I didn't know that I had pulled the wine bottle from its perch at that point, not until it shattered on the floor when I dropped it. The candlestick in my other hand too. Its flame snuffed out on the stones below. The thing on the floor was moving. I could hear it now. It sounded wet. The stench grew worse, filling my lungs like poison. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. Don't you see me? I grabbed the other, unbroken bottle of wine. Don't you hear me? I turned my back to it in order to flee up the stairs, nearly slipping on the step and losing the last bottle. I was frantic, reaching the top of the stairs and shutting the door behind me. It swung on its hinges harder than I had intended, an echoing thunk against the frame. My breaths were ragged, pleading things. I tried to regain my composure out of sight of the Duarden, hoping he didn't. Everything all right? Came his gravelly voice from the other room. My mouth went dry when I tried to speak. Yes. I managed. Why yes, of course. I found a tankard in the cupboard and walked everything back out to the main hall. Bottle and tankard cradled in an arm, clinking off each other. I was shaking. He was right where I left him. There was some measure of relief knowing he was right here, unworried. He turned to me and I grinned, holding up the tankard and wine bottle. I think he knew my smile was forced. I appreciated that he returned it all the same. Such a strange Duarden, the most perceptive of them I had met. There was an urge inside me, an urge to just tell this stranger everything. Confession, every fear, every worry, every single thing that I put into the mirror, which was full, the mirror which couldn't take anything anymore. I had no place to put my sorrow. Maybe he would do. At least then I wouldn't be alone in my knowledge of it. But I couldn't. It was too much. Would only serve to scare him off along with all his realm stone. I set the tankard and bottle on the table in front of him. Much obliged, he said. And from the sound of it, there's one less bottle down there, eh? He said with a smile. I nodded, still thinking about what was in the cellar. He chuckled. Just my luck. Grin Garrison, at your service. Or I suppose you're at mine, though that's a frightful way to put it. So, Grin, hoping to just stay for the night, and then continue the waste road in the morning. Also dawning on me, I didn't catch the name of my host. Vendriel, I said, struggling to keep the shiver from my voice. He pulled out the cork with his teeth and poured as much as he could fit into the tankard, the wine glugging in its rush from the bottle. I stared into the fire. Could he see me shaking? Would the cellar thing come upstairs? Have you seen anyone on your way? I asked him. Someone who looks like me? The Duarden chuckled. Close to 20 of them, I'd imagine. I'm in the spot for it though, aren't I? He took a drink of wine, and his face twisted into a sour grimace. Blag. He grabbed his beard and mocked the wine from his mouth. Yeah, on the hunt for someone? I regretted even asking in the first place. How would he know? My sister, she. Oh, it's nothing, I said. I should not have mentioned it. It was inappropriate. Forgive me. You're the only one here? In the whole Toeran place? Well, and you keep up all right? Yeah, look a bit, he said, before catching himself. He took another drink, staring at the fire. Just must be a lot of work for ya. He shrugged, downing the rest of the wine like water, in one gulp. I just mean to say, if you're looking for someone, I can keep an eye out. Might catch him on my way back. Interrupting my thoughts of the cellar were the memories of other guests I never saw again. I nodded back in the direction of the door. There aren't many who survive the journey across the wastes, I said, let alone the return, if they even make it to Oraniscaf. The Duarden looked over at whatever it was wrapped in all those blankets. Some things worth it. Besides, Grin jerked a large thumb at his pack on the table. All ya need is a dream and some hardtack, and ya can get through anything. I stole another glance back at the kitchen, hoping he wouldn't notice, expecting whatever was in the cellar to be standing there. I couldn't tolerate the pleasantries for much longer. I'll go and ready your room, I said, turning towards the stairs, thinking of trying the mirror again. Prayers to Isha for a different result, a magical hollowing of the stored emotions inside the other quartz. But Grin waved his hand dismissively. I can kip air. Fire's already going and all. So long as ya don't mind, of course. Not exactly a horde of guests banging on your door. Pardon. This chair right here is the most comfort I've had in more days than I could count. Ya go doin' what needs doin'. I'll be good air, specially with this vile stumble juice, he said, grinning once more and holding up the tankard. Anyway, ya can keep the payment with ya, so ya can trust in old Duarden and your own. I showed him the pantry and told him to take what he wished. It wasn't extensive, but it was better than hardtack. I laid furs and blankets on the hearth, bolted the front door for him, and took the realm stone with me when I went upstairs to my room. Our room. But the mirror was as I feared. Useless again. There was no hope in spiriting the horrors of the cellar away. All I wanted was to think clearly so that I could deal with it, so that I could be strong. Like your sister. I locked the bedroom door before I lay down in bed, though I knew sleep would never come. My worried heart was beating like a war drum. My mind drifted to the cellar. What would I do if I was like this forever? The fears circled around me like a pack of siry waste wolves in the bedroom as the rhythmic cadence of snores from below came and went. I saw the beginnings of daylight at the window, not yet enough to illuminate the room. Dawn already. I was pulling myself up from the bed when I heard a scratch, like someone dragging their fingernail down the roughened wood of the bedroom door. The door, the one I had locked shut, was open, and something was walking inside. Too tall to be the Duarden. Tall, like her. The thing's weight shifted on the floorboards, but I couldn't see anything clearly. It was swallowed by the shadows of the room. I couldn't see it anymore. "Can you hear me?" it asked with the voice from the mirror. It sounded close to me. Behind me. Somehow behind me. "Can you hear me?" it asked again, cold lips brushing my ear. I turned to find Velethir there, next to me on the bed as if she had been there all this time. She smiled. I screamed, because something was inside her mouth, and when she opened it to show her smile, I could see it writhing around like a worm in the soil. It looked like a finger, grime, or worse, caked beneath its nail. Many fingers. Velethir was in disarray, like she had walked the perilous paths to Oreniscath and back herself, tattered and torn. "Can you see me now?" she said, stepping back into the corner of my room with the mirror. Her ruined fingers, the ones on her hands as they were supposed to be, caressed the shards still within it. "Velethir." My voice was shaking and weak like the rest of me, lying helpless on the bed. Where have you been?" She didn't respond, didn't speak. She just turned back to me and opened her mouth again. It grew wider, plummeting towards the floorboards just like out on the road, and something was waiting for me there, in the impossible black void of her mouth, the growing doorway. I didn't want to find out what it was. "I'm right here," the darkness said, "waiting for you." And then she hurried from the room, her mouth, once a stretched and broken thing, shriveling back to its old form, and I could hear her footsteps on the stairs, leaving me rattled and alone in the bedroom. I could hardly breathe. I pushed myself up from the bed. My heart raced in fear, threatening to beat too quickly, too violently, burst out of me. The Duarden, I thought, with something of relief. I stepped outside the door I had bolted, and heard nothing down to the ground floor. The love of my sister carrying me down the stairs and through the fear which threatened to collapse me. There was no one there, no source of the noise near any table, the hearth, the kitchens. Nothing, save for a scrap of parchment on the table next to the hearth, a scrawl like a child's on it, in the common tongue. I recognized a torn bit of my own parchment from the ledger, held in place by a tankard, which rattled with something inside it when I pulled the parchment free. A tip of more realm stone. The Duarden must have received much more of it than he let on, and must truly be a complete anomaly within his own race, to be so generous with it. Early start. Need it, if I'm going to beat your lot's pace. Tall as damn trees. The wine was dreadful, unlike you. I hope you find your kin. The note deepened the well of terror within me. I went over to the door and opened it. Pale dawn light filling the entryway. There had been more snow in the night. Grin's cart-shaped path led through it from the door of the inn and out into the road. I was alone then, just like before. Vendriel. The voice. The thing that masqueraded as Velethir. Sister so alone. The voice was upstairs. The mirror again. It was louder, this time. Vendriel. I couldn't bear this any longer. I climbed the stairs, hurried back to the mirror on the wall. I stared into it, at my reflection, the only twin I had left. I grabbed the mirror by its edges, the fine gold filigree which held her favorite children, her precious, precious children, and pulled on it with everything I could, stronger in terror than I could have ever been. And the mirror was wrenched from the wall, tearing splinters from the wood it was fixed to. I gripped the mirror in one hand and had the bones of amber tucked away, hidden in the pocket of my apron. I moved with purpose through the house, finding myself before the front door. I could run. I could do it. I undid the latch once more, letting the frigid air inside. All I needed to do was take the other road, forge my own path away from Grin's stout trail through the snow. Once I reached the small town at the crossroads, I could trade the bones for ether quartz. I could free myself of this horrible cloud of fear and pain, long enough to figure this out, figure everything out, find the truth, for good or ill. I wondered if this was how all my wanderings began, with Vendriel? The voice that sounded behind me was different. It was not the voice from before. It was too clear, too full of sorrow, too bright, and not some sinister whisper. It was my sister's voice, my real sister's voice. Vendriel? It's Mother. Vendriel, please. She needs help. I turned from the door, leaving it open, but there was no one behind me. "Vendriel," she called, from somewhere in the kitchen, from the cellar door. I took the few steps across the room until I stood before it, the cold draft on my feet and ankles once again. I did not know what waited on the other side. Whatever the thing my sister was now, if it was ever her at all. I reached for the handle with my trembling hand and opened it. She was waiting for me at the foot of the stairs. At first, I thought it could really be her. It could be, standing there and staring up at me, her head to the side as if to get a better view of me in the light. Her mouth broke as it stretched back open, and so too broke my desperate hope. The horrible crack and grind of bone on bone, the sickening tear of flesh, and now I know the writhing thing inside. A tongue, a disgusting, whip-like thing of deep violet, impossibly long. "Who are you?" I whispered. "You." It could have just been the echo of my question. All around me. "Your sister." I turned and ran before the thing caught me. The tongue was writhing madly as it coiled around me. It must have slithered up the stairs in half a heartbeat because it was already wrapped around me, winding its way up to my face, digging into my skin in a grotesque embrace, and I saw all of them, the thousands of them, the tiny hooked barbs pushing out of the tongue and burying themselves into my skin. "Your family." And then came the pull, tearing me down into the void, my head hitting stone and stair alike until all was darkness. I woke on the floor of the cellar. I wondered if it was all a dream from the night before, and I had simply lost my balance. Fell down the stairs. The Duarden could be there. Right there, above me now, but I felt a pain all over. I bled from small thin cuts. The ones not from the hooked barbs of the thing's tongue were shards of wine glass lodged in my skin, the broken bottle of the night before. I could see them in the thin daylight filtering through the cracks of the cellar door above. They glinted in that light above like so many shards of my own. Ether quartz fixed into me instead of the mirror. The light from the door was enough to see her by. Velithir stood at the other end of the cellar, by the furnace. They were both smiling at me, my sister and the furnace. Something was wrong with her eyes, and her monstrous tongue was no dream. Her mouth was as closed as it could be, at an odd, broken angle. Her teeth like gravel in her mouth, crumbled, jagged things, as if she had bitten down upon stone. Her tongue, the writhing thing of purple and black, passed over her broken teeth, licking the blood that dribbled down her mouth. "Sister, where have you been?" she said. I heard the voice in my head. Her mouth could not have managed it. Every part of me tensed. I felt the mirror in my grip, realizing I still clutched the thing in one hand. I could feel blood running down to my fingers and onto it. I gripped the mirror more tightly, the shards digging into my skin. It grounded me. "Who are you?" I asked the thing in the corner with as much strength as I could muster. A stranger, a fool, a guest. The voice was all around, inside my head and out, echoing everywhere in the dark cellar. I shut my eyes, as if that would stop the voice. "Vendriel? Vendriel? Sister, stop!" I screamed, throwing the mirror towards the laughing thing, hitting the stone floor in front of it, where it shattered, the gold filigree bent at violent angles, the ether quartz breaking free of it, clacking away on the floor like useless gravel on the ground. And that's what they were, the last of our supply. Useless, leaving me here with everything I would sooner forget. The broken pieces of the mirror glistened on the ground, and I finally knew what the other things on the floor were. Now, the spent shards, full of all our pain, blackened, charred things, burnt with an unknowable fire. A swirling light began to glow inside the furnace as if brought about by my recognition, casting a violet glow. A figure crawled from it, limbs stepping on the shards of our broken hearts and ripped out thoughts, here on the floor, never freed as Mother said they were, never mended, never safeguarded, merely hidden, dirt swept under a rug. The other thing stuck out its claws, reaching behind the furnace into the corner, claws closing around something I couldn't see. It pulled that something forward, into the light. Its claws were closed around a hand, like the furnace figure was introducing a new guest. I half expected the Duarden, but the hand it held was limp and lifeless, the body it belonged to forgotten behind the furnace all this time. I did not need to see the rest of the corpse to know who it was. The hand was thin, too thin, the hand that picked me up from the ground whenever I had fallen. And now my sister was laughing, and I knew she never went missing after all. Neither did Mother. It was too much to stand. Perhaps from the blood leaving me. Perhaps from my entire world shattering like a mirror on a cellar floor. This time the voice did come from her mouth, blood seeping from the cracked and torn skin, bits of bone threatening to do the same elsewhere. I have never known such a feast, she said. I saw her face now, its face, the thing that wore my sister, the being we must have brought here with our suffering. She took a step towards me, her eyes never breaking from my own. I could hear the thing's bare feet on the stone floor. Nothing like it. And they sounded wet. It must be the blood on the floor. Hers or mine. I did not know. She was closer now. I will keep all of your secrets, every sordid one, whispering in my ear, and I will feast on them. The thing's tongue ran over the cracked and broken teeth, reduced to ruin in her mouth. Forever. Festival and drawing a disapproving eye from most of the elves he met, until they were distracted by the thing he brought for all to see. A helm, unbreakable, layered so expertly with runework that it would render the bearer impervious to most magical harm. It had certainly saved his life on the way here, even without wearing it. The shadow magic at work in the Siri Wastes was no match for Grin Garrison, or for any who bore the Garrison helm. In truth, he'd never experienced anything like the Siri festival, not even in Azur. He'd received no fewer than 7 offers for his helm, each greater than the last. And now his pushcart was empty save for his pack and a fine leathered pouch filled with ether quartz. The elf noble who paid such a handsome price suggested he'd find the Duarden dead somewhere on the road, the ether quartz stolen, though Grin assured him he could make short work of anyone up close with his trusted hammer. But Grin's real weapon was his uncharacteristic enthusiasm, wasn't it? A cheeriness not found in most other folk. It befuddled most, angered others. The innkeeper he met on the way to the festival, Vendriel, was one of the former. Grin had been on the road back from Aranisgath for too many days, taking a good deal longer on the return journey to exercise a bit more caution without the helm's protection this time. On this day, he had been looking up from the snow-covered ground every few feet in the hope of catching a glimpse of the Somewhere Sister. And now, finally, here it was. It stood at the edge of the tree, halfway home. Then, Grin was eager for a rest and a roof over his head. Even another tankard full of dreadful wine would do quite nicely, as he'd already drunk the flagons of beer he bought for the journey in Aranisgath. The only shame in that, he told himself, was not buying more. But a rest would do nicely, perhaps for even more than a single night, especially after one of the wheels on his cart had splintered, which meant a whole lot more dragging than pulling. Even with a lightened load and Grin's optimism, the pain in his back was enough to allow some measure of doubt in making it back to the Somewhere Sister by nightfall. Still, quicker than him carrying it all on his back. The front door was open. He tied the leather pouch of earnings on his belt next to the hammer as he climbed the steps to the door, pushing it open with a booted foot, snow falling from it to the floor inside. It was dark and cold. No fire in the hearth. Hello? He asked the shadows of the room. There. Something on the floor, just around the corner. He drew the hammer from his belt. The old anvil hammer, as much for working his craft as for punching through armor and equally good at both. The thing on the floor disappeared behind the wall. Grin followed. The door to the cellar was open. Grin quieted his breath, staying close to the wall and raising the hammer higher as he peered through the doorway. The innkeeper was standing in the darkness at the foot of the stairs, looking up at him. Her silhouette was all he could see, eyes reflecting what light there was at the top of the stairs. Vendriel, he said, his gruff voice needing an extra push. Stay. She had brought her hands up, and they were holding something rough-edged, glistening, like crystals in the mines. Ether quartz, like the shards in his leather pouch. Absurdly, he thought she was demanding more payment. When she smiled at him, he saw the blood, too, like she was eating them. No matter the damage done to what used to be an even row of teeth, now resembling the jagged, broken crystals she held out to him. There's plenty to go around. Another figure was behind Vendriel. They were identical, though this one seemed to be taller. Someone like me, he remembered. She found her family then. They climbed the steps towards him. He cursed himself, knowing he couldn't run. Not now. He'd barely make it to the door. Grin gripped his hammer, readying a blow. When her mouth began to open, it didn't stop when it should have, impossibly continuing. The sharp cracks of bone breaking, skin stretching itself too thin. He brought the hammer down, muttering an apology that never reached his lips, dying on the way there, when something halted his hammer hand in an explosion of pain, holding it back from its skull-shattering blow. "Arg!" he shouted, his grip on the hammer loosening, dropping it down the stairwell. Something else fell along with it. Hardtack, from one of his pockets. Not that it had far to fall, but it sure didn't break. The thing that was wrapped around his wrist, the thing that stopped his swing was, impossibly, a tongue, or the grotesque exaggeration of one. There was a third elf, if elves they still were, there in the cellar, and this one had its impossible violet tongue writhing around his arm like a serpent, sinking its sharp barbs into him, shredding the skin beneath as it moved. His arm felt like it was on fire, nearly torn from him when the tongue pulled him down the unforgiving stairs, and Grin landed in a heap at the feet of the things in the cellar. He could feel blood running down his arm, pooling on the stone floor. The one who used to be Vendriel loomed over him, and Grin struggled to keep his eyes open, to meet her gaze. But the blood falling from her ruin of a mouth soaked his face. He peered up at her through the blackened blood. Vendriel had taken the pouch of ether quartz from his belt. There was something of recognition in her eyes that looked like their old selves, staring down at the glimmering shards tumbling from the pouch and into her hands. Her eyes found his. "There is no pain here." "Yep, bloody liar." Grin managed through the blood. He tried to lift his arm, but the pain was immense, the barbed things digging deeper into his skin. Useless without pain. Vendriel let the shards fall from her hand. They scattered, landing in the growing pool of Grin's blood, which crept along the cellar floor and towards the shadowed corner. He could see something reflected in the blood. Now, a light from the corner. It was a furnace, a roaring, otherworldly fire of violet inside it. The metal grate which covered the furnace was stained with soot. It curled upwards at the ends, bent from use and time. It was smiling,